My name is Sarah. I'm 23 years old. And tonight I discovered that everything I believed about my life was a carefully constructed lie. The moment I walked through the front door of what I thought was my childhood home, I could feel the weight of secrets hanging in the air like smoke from a fire that had been burning for years without anyone bothering to put it out. Mom was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold hours ago, and Dad stood by the window with his back to me, his shoulders rigid with the kind of tension that comes from carrying burdens too heavy. For one person, the silence between them was deafening, filled with words they had been avoiding for decades. I had come home early from college to surprise them for their anniversary, but instead I found myself walking into a nightmare that would reshape everything I thought I knew about who I was and where I came from. The manila envelope on the counter caught my eye immediately, official documents spilling out like accusations waiting to be read. And when Mom finally looked up at me, her eyes were red with tears she had been trying to hold back since morning. That's when I knew that this wasn't going to be a celebration of love and commitment, but rather the beginning of the end of everything I had ever considered sacred and true about my family. The first words out of Mom's mouth weren't the usual warm greeting I expected, but instead a broken whisper that cut through the silence like a blade through silk. She said my name the way people say goodbye, with a finality that made my stomach drop and my hands shake as I set down my overnight bag. Dad turned around then, and I could see that he had aged years in the weeks since I had seen him last, his face drawn and hollow as if something vital had been drained from him. The documents on the counter seemed to pulse with importance, demanding my attention even as I tried to focus on my parents' faces, searching for some explanation that would make sense of the atmosphere that felt thick with impending doom. Mom reached for one of the papers with trembling fingers, and I noticed for the first time how small she looked sitting there, diminished somehow, as if the truth they were about to tell me had already begun to erase parts of who she used to be. Dad moved closer to the table, his movements slow and deliberate, like a man walking toward his own execution, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible, as if saying the words any louder might somehow make them more real than they already were. The weight of their secret pressed down on all of us, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to believe that just 20 minutes ago I had been driving home with a smile on my face, completely unaware that my world was about to shatter into pieces so small I would never be able to put them back together again. The truth came out in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across years of carefully maintained silence. Mom spoke first, her voice breaking as she explained that the birth certificate I had always known was not the original one, that there had been another document, another name, another family that I had never been told about. Dad added details, with each pause in her confession filling in the gaps with information that felt like physical blows to my chest, each revelation hitting harder than the last. They told me about the adoption that wasn't supposed to be an adoption, about papers signed in desperation and love, about a teenage girl who had made an impossible choice because she believed it was the only way to give her baby a chance at a better life. The girl's name was Jennifer, and she was only 16 when she carried me for 9 months, feeling me grow inside her while she made plans to give me away. Mom and Dad had been trying to have children for 7 years when they found Jennifer through a private agency, and they promised her that they would love me as if I were their own biological child, that they would never tell me the truth unless circumstances forced their hand. But circumstances had indeed forced their hand, because Jennifer had been searching for me, and she had found me, and now she wanted to meet the daughter she had given up 23 years ago. The papers on the counter were from a private investigator she had hired, along with court documents requesting contact, and a letter she had written to me explaining why she had made the decision she made all those years ago. Asterisk reading Jennifer's letter felt like drowning in someone else's emotions, her words reaching across 2 decades to grab me by the throat and pull me into a story I never knew I was part of. She wrote about being scared and alone, about parents who threw her out when they discovered her pregnancy, about sleeping in her car and working 3 part-time jobs just to afford prenatal vitamins. She described the way I moved inside her womb, how she would talk to me during those long, lonely nights, telling me about the family she was trying to find for me, the people who would have everything she couldn't provide. The love in her words was overwhelming and devastating at the same time. A mother's love that had been forced into hiding for 23 years but had never diminished, never faded, never stopped hoping for this moment of reconnection. She included pictures too, photographs of herself at 16, holding her swollen belly with both hands, smiling despite the circumstances. And I could see myself in her face, in the curve of her nose and the shape of her eyes. There were more recent photos as well, showing the woman she had become, a nurse now, married with 2 other children who didn't know they had an older sister somewhere in the world. Mom watched me read with tears streaming down her face, and Dad kept apologizing over and over, saying they had wanted to tell me but never found the right time, never found the courage to risk losing me to the truth. But the truth had found us anyway, and now we all had to figure out how to live with it, how to navigate this new reality where I belonged to 2 families and neither at the same time. Asterisk. The days that followed were a blur of phone calls and meetings, conversations with lawyers and social workers who specialized in reunion cases like mine, people who spoke in gentle voices about the complexity of emotions I was experiencing and the importance of taking things slowly. Jennifer and I exchanged messages through a mediator at first, careful words that danced around the magnitude of what we were attempting to rebuild after so many years apart. She told me about her life, about the nursing degree she had earned by working nights and going to school during the day, about the husband who knew about me and supported her search, about the 2 children who were excited to learn they had a big sister. I told her about college, about my major in education, about the parents who had raised me with so much love that I had never questioned whether I truly belonged to them. But even as we shared these details about our separate lives, there was an undercurrent of grief for all the years we had missed, all the moments that could never be recovered or relived. Mom and Dad tried to be supportive, but I could see the fear in their eyes, the worry that I might choose my biological mother over them, that I might decide their love wasn't enough now that I knew the truth about my origins. The irony wasn't lost on me that in trying to protect their relationship with me, they had created the very situation they had been afraid of, because now I felt like I didn't fully belong anywhere, caught between 2 families who both had legitimate claims on my heart, but neither of whom could offer me the complete sense of identity I desperately craved. Asterisk. The first phone call with Jennifer lasted 3 hours, and by the end of it, we were both crying so hard we could barely speak. Her voice was exactly what I had imagined it would be, warm and gentle, with a slight accent that suggested she had never traveled far from the small town where I was born. She told me stories about her pregnancy, about the books she read to me while I was still in her womb, about the playlist she created of songs she wanted me to hear before I was born. She had kept a journal during those 9 months, documenting every doctor's appointment, every milestone, every moment of fear and hope and love, and she offered to share it with me if I wanted to read it. The journal was like discovering a secret history of my existence, pages filled with the handwriting of a girl who was barely older than a child herself, but who was already thinking like a mother, putting my needs before her own in ways that took my breath away. She wrote about the couple who would become my parents, about meeting them for the first time and feeling relieved that they seemed so eager to love me, about the final days before my birth when she could barely sleep because she knew our time together was running out. The last entry was dated 2 days after I was born, just before she signed the papers that would make the adoption final. And it was filled with promises she was making to me, even though she knew I would never hear them. Promises to think about me every day, to wonder how I was growing and learning and becoming the person I was meant to be. Reading those words felt like being embraced by someone I had never met, but who would love me longer than anyone else in the world. Meeting Jennifer in person was nothing like I had expected and everything I had hoped for all at once. We arranged to meet at a small cafe halfway between our two cities, neutral ground where neither of us would have the advantage of familiar surroundings. I arrived early and sat in a corner booth, my hands shaking as I watched every woman who walked through the door, wondering if this one or that one might be the person who had given me life. When she finally appeared, I knew her immediately, not because she looked exactly like me, but because something deep in my chest recognized her presence before my eyes even registered her face. She was smaller than I had imagined, more fragile, somehow, with graying hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of years of worry and wonder about the child she had given away. That when she smiled, I saw my own smile reflected back at me, and when she reached out to touch my hand, her fingers were exactly the same length as mine. We spent the first hour just looking at each other, drinking coffee that grew cold, while we tried to absorb the reality of being in the same space after 23 years apart. She brought more photos, albums full of pictures that chronicled her life from the day she gave me up until now. And I could see in her face the shadow of grief that had never quite left her eyes. She had always wondered if she had made the right choice, she told me. Always wondered if I was happy and healthy and loved. Always wondered if someday I might want to know the truth about where I came from and why she had let me go. The conversation with Jennifer revealed details about my biological father that Mom and Dad had never known. Information that added another layer of complexity to my already complicated sense of identity. His name was Michael, and he was 17 when I was conceived. A boy who panicked when Jennifer told him she was pregnant and disappeared from her life so completely that she never saw him again. She had tried to find him over the years, not because she wanted anything from him, but because she thought I might want to know about that side of my genetic heritage. But he had covered his tracks well and seemed determined to pretend that night had never happened. Jennifer described him with a mixture of sadness and understanding, acknowledging that they had both been too young to handle the responsibility of parenthood, but wishing he had been brave enough to at least stay in touch, to know what had become of the child they had created together. She showed me a picture of him from high school, a tall, lanky boy with dark hair and serious eyes, and I could see traces of his features in my own face, the shape of my jawline and the way my eyebrows curved. It was strange to look at this stranger and know that half of my DNA had come from him, that somewhere out there was a man who had no idea he had a daughter who had grown up to become a teacher, who might have children of his own now who were my half-siblings, an entire branch of my family tree that remained completely unknown to me. Jennifer promised to keep looking for him if I wanted her to, but she also made it clear that she wouldn't pressure me to pursue that connection if I wasn't ready for it, understanding better than anyone how overwhelming it could be to discover that your life story was so much more complicated than you had ever imagined. The impact of these revelations on my relationship with Mom and Dad was immediate and devastating, creating a distance between us that felt impossible to bridge despite all the love we shared. They tried to act normal, to pretend that nothing fundamental had changed between us. But I could see the fear in their eyes every time I mentioned Jennifer's name or talked about the things we had discussed. Dad started working longer hours, staying at the office until late in the evening as if avoiding home might somehow avoid the reality of what we were all going through. Mom became obsessively helpful, cooking my favorite meals and buying me small gifts as if she could somehow prove her worthiness as my mother through acts of service and devotion. But their efforts to maintain our old dynamic only highlighted how much everything had changed. How the simple, uncomplicated love we had shared for 23 years had become something more complex and fragile and uncertain. I found myself analyzing every interaction we had ever had, looking for signs that they had been keeping secrets, moments when they might have almost told me the truth but decided against it. The bedtime stories Dad used to tell me about Brave. Princesses who found their true families took on new meaning, and Mom's insistence that I was her miracle baby felt different now that I knew she hadn't carried me in her womb. Even the way they looked at me seemed different, as if they were constantly measuring my love for them against my growing curiosity about Jennifer and the life I might have had if different choices had been made 23 years ago. Jennifer's husband David and their 2 children, Emma and Noah, welcomed me into their family with an enthusiasm that was both touching and overwhelming, treating me as if I had always been part of their lives despite the fact that they had only learned about my existence a few months earlier. David was a quiet, thoughtful man who worked as a mechanic and spent his free time building furniture in his garage. And he had been completely supportive of Jennifer's search for me from the moment she first mentioned it years earlier. Emma was 15, a sophomore in high school who played violin and wanted to be a veterinarian. And she peppered me with questions about college and dating and whether I had ever wondered about having siblings. Noah was 12, obsessed with baseball and video games, and he seemed to think it was the coolest thing in the world that he suddenly had an older sister who could help him with his homework and teach him how to drive when the time came. Their house was small and cluttered with the detritus of family life, sports equipment and school projects and half-finished crafts covering every available surface. But it felt warm and lived in a way that made me understand something about the childhood I might have had if circumstances had been different. Jennifer showed me the room that would have been mine, the space that was now Noah's bedroom but had once been decorated with yellow walls and white furniture because she hadn't known whether she was having a boy or a girl. She had kept some things, baby clothes and toys and books she had bought during those hopeful early months of pregnancy before reality set in and she realized she wouldn't be able to keep me, and she offered to give them to me now as keepsakes of the life that might have been. The guilt I felt about enjoying my time with Jennifer's family was almost unbearable, a constant weight in my chest that made it hard to fully embrace the joy of these new relationships without feeling like I was betraying the people who had raised me. Every laugh I shared with Emma, every story David told me about Jennifer's nursing school days, every hug Noah gave me before I left their house felt like evidence that I was choosing them over Mom and Dad, that I was being disloyal to the people who had loved me unconditionally for 23 years. But at the same time, I couldn't deny the sense of recognition I felt when I was with them. The way certain gestures and expressions and turns of phrase seemed familiar even though I had never experienced them before. Jennifer and I had the same habit of twisting our hair when we were thinking, the same tendency to hum unconsciously while we worked, the same preference for reading multiple books at once rather than finishing one before starting another. These small similarities felt like puzzle pieces clicking into place, helping me understand parts of myself that had never made sense before. Personality traits and preferences that Mom and Dad had always attributed to my unique individuality, but that now revealed themselves to be genetic inheritances from a woman I was only just beginning to know. The complexity of loving 2 families simultaneously was exhausting, requiring a constant balancing act that left me feeling emotionally drained and uncertain about where I truly belonged. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in adoption issues, a kind woman who helped me understand that it was possible to love both families without diminishing either relationship, that the human heart was capable of expanding to accommodate new connections without losing the strength of existing ones. The conversation I had been dreading finally happened on a rainy Thursday evening when Mom confronted me about the amount of time I was spending with Jennifer's family, her voice shaking with hurt and anger as she accused me of replacing them with the people who had given me away. She said things that night that I knew she didn't mean, words born of fear and insecurity that cut deep anyway, questions about whether I had ever really loved them or if I had always been waiting for my real family to find me. Dad tried to mediate, his voice calm and reasonable, as he reminded Mom that this was exactly what they had been afraid of, that their secrecy had created the very situation they had been trying to avoid, but his words only seemed to make her angrier. She stormed out of the room, leaving Dad and me sitting in uncomfortable silence while the rain pounded against the windows. Like tears the sky couldn't hold back anymore. When I tried to explain that my relationship with Jennifer didn't diminish my love for them, that I wasn't trying to choose between families, but rather trying to understand all the pieces of who I was, Dad nodded with understanding, but I could see the sadness in his eyes, the fear that he was losing the daughter he had raised to become someone else's child. The fight lasted for hours, voices raised and then lowered, accusations made and then retracted, apologies offered and accepted and offered again, until we were all too exhausted to continue and agreed to table the discussion until we could approach it with clearer heads and calmer hearts. But the damage had been done, the unspoken fears finally given voice, and we all knew that our family would never quite be the same as it had been before that night when secrets finally came to light. The breakthrough in my relationship with Michael came unexpectedly through a Facebook message from a woman named Lisa who had seen Jennifer's posts in an adoption reunion group and recognized the name and description from stories her brother had told years ago about a girl he had gotten pregnant in high school. She reached out cautiously, not wanting to cause trouble, but thinking I might want to know that she believed Michael was her brother and that he now lived in California with a wife and 3 children who had no idea about my existence. Lisa was kind and diplomatic, explaining that Michael had never spoken about me directly, but that she had overheard conversations between him and their mother about a girl named Jennifer and a baby he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Regrets that had followed him into adulthood and shaped his relationships in ways that his current family didn't understand. She offered to serve as an intermediary if I wanted to make contact, warning me that he might not be receptive to the idea of reunion, but assuring me that she would do her best to help him understand that I wasn't looking for anything from him, except the chance to know where it came from. The prospect of reaching out to my biological father was even more daunting than meeting Jennifer had been, because while she had been searching for me, he had apparently spent 23 years trying to forget I existed. But with Lisa's help, we crafted a careful message that emphasized my happiness with my adoptive family while expressing curiosity about my paternal heritage. And after weeks of nervous waiting, Michael finally agreed to a phone conversation that would either provide closure or open another chapter in my increasingly complex family story. Michael's voice on the phone was deeper than I had expected, tinged with an accent that suggested he had spent years in the South, and the first thing he did was apologize for the way he had handled the situation 23 years ago, acknowledging that his behavior had been cowardly and selfish, even though he had been young and scared. He told me about the life he had built in California, about his work as a software engineer and his wife Sarah, who shared my name, about their 3 children who ranged in age from 8 to 16. He had never told Sarah about me, he admitted, with obvious shame, had never told anyone except Lisa about the baby he had helped create and then abandoned before I was even born. The conversation was awkward and stilted at first, both of us unsure how to navigate this relationship that had no precedent or protocol. But gradually we found common ground in our shared love of music and books, interests that had apparently been passed down through his DNA, along with my brown eyes and stubborn streak. He sent me pictures of his children, my half-siblings who looked enough like me that strangers might assume we had grown up together, and I could see pieces of myself reflected in their faces, genetic echoes that had been passed down through generations. Michael was careful not to overstep boundaries, making it clear that he didn't expect or want to be considered my father in any meaningful sense, that he understood I already had parents who had earned that title through years of love and devotion. But he also expressed genuine interest in knowing me as an adult and understanding who I had become despite his absence. And he offered to help me learn about his side of the family tree if I was interested in exploring those connections. Family dinner where I introduced Jennifer to Mom and Dad was the most surreal experience of my life. Watching these 3 people who had shaped my existence in different ways attempt to find common ground in their shared love for me. Mom had been resistant to the idea at first, arguing that it was too soon for such a meeting, that we all needed more time to adjust to our new reality before bringing everyone together in one room. But I could see that her real fear was that meeting Jennifer would somehow make her own role in my life seem less important, that seeing me with my biological mother would highlight all the ways she had fallen short as an adoptive parent. Jennifer was nervous too, arriving at the restaurant early and changing her outfit twice in the parking lot before finally walking inside with a bouquet of flowers for Mom and a bottle of wine for Dad. Peace offerings that seemed ridiculously small given the magnitude of what we were attempting. But something magical happened during that meal. A gradual softening of defenses as Jennifer expressed her gratitude for the life Mom and Dad had given me. Her admiration for the woman I had become under their guidance. Her certainty that she could never have provided the opportunities and experiences that had shaped me into the person sitting at that table. Mom began to relax as she realized that Jennifer wasn't trying to compete with her, but rather to complement the family structure that already existed, to add to my life without taking anything away from theirs. By the end of the evening, they were sharing stories about me, laughing about my childhood quirks and teenage rebellions, marveling at the ways I had inherited traits from both families, despite being raised by only one of them. 6 months after that night when my world shifted on its axis, I can finally say that I understand what family really means. Not the simple definition I had carried for 23 years, but the complex, multi-layered reality that encompasses biology and choice, blood and love, history and possibility. Mom and Dad are still my parents in every way that matters. The people who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework and held me when I cried over broken hearts and celebrated my achievements as if they were their own. But Jennifer, as part of my story too, the woman who gave me life and then made the hardest decision any mother can make, trusting strangers to love me the way she couldn't at 16. Michael remains a peripheral figure, someone I talk to occasionally, but who will probably never be more than a genetic contributor to my existence. And that's okay, because not every relationship needs to be deep or meaningful to have value. Emma and Noah have become the siblings I never knew I wanted, and David treats me with the easy affection of someone who has watched me grow up, even though we only met this year. My therapist says it's taken remarkable courage for all of us to navigate this reunion with such grace and openness, to expand our definition of family without destroying what already existed. Tonight, as I write this, I'm sitting in the bedroom that was once my childhood sanctuary, surrounded by photos that now include faces I didn't know existed 6 months ago. And I realized that losing one family gave me the gift of gaining several others. The night my family stopped being my family was also the night my family became bigger than I ever imagined possible. And I wouldn't change a single moment of this beautiful, complicated, heartbreaking, joy-filled journey that brought me home to all the people who love me.